Uh-oh. Okay, we'll start with this. The numbers are in for the Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano trilogy on Netflix this past weekend, according to scribe Doneg Corby. Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano had 4.2 million live viewers on Netflix, with 6 million tuning in from the first to last bell. Most viewed women's sporting event of 2025, beats out other streaming boxing events such as KSI versus Logan Paul 2 and the Prime card. Other noteworthy stats: it was in front of a sold-out crowd of 19,721 spectators in attendance, generating $2.63 million at the gate at MSG. The show broke a Guinness World Record for the most World Championship belts ever contested on a single fight card, male or female, with 17 world titles. It's almost 3 times the amount of people who watched the first fight live on DAZN. And for anyone questioning the source of this information, media were just sent this statement from broadcaster Netflix and MVP. These are independently verified numbers and tell a story of massive interest for the women on this card, as well as the promoters. So this is how you further elevate the sport of women's boxing, because you can't do it with individual accolades. All that really does is glorify the individual. Fighting on massive stages in front of massive audiences further normalizes the conversation to where it's not at all a novelty to have an all-women's show or women headlining one. The amount of people that were in attendance in tandem with how many people viewed it at home, and I was curious about that. How many people would this draw on Netflix? 4 to 6 million people is a robust number, even for a massive platform like Netflix, because you have to think of it as being tantamount to a terrestrial network. Like when Keith Thurman and Danny Garcia fought on NBC. I believe that brought in somewhere in between 5 and 6 million viewers to that network. That was a very big fight that year, even if the aesthetic disappointed. What the numbers showed was that there was a lot of interest in that fight. It was the same with Errol Spence Jr. when he fought, I think it was Leonard Bundu. Those numbers are a good parallel for these, between 4 and 6 million viewers on ESPN. But of course, because we're talking about an all-women's show and 2 women in the main event, you do have to grade it on a curve.
How so?
It's an even more monumental achievement when you're talking about an all-women's show and 2 women in the main event, because there was a time where that would have been viewed as a novelty. Here today, it is becoming the norm, and a number like that, 4 to 6 million people, accents a market with an appetite. Something that Netflix can further invest in, and not just Netflix, but other broadcasters too. Reacting to the card, Claressa Shields, who has a fight of her own coming up, stated, "After tonight, I can absolutely agree, I am the GOAT. Nobody that fought tonight can beat me in a fight at no weight class. Hashtag Claressa Shields, hashtag GOAT." The boxing community at large has grown accustomed to Claressa Shields doing stuff like this, but just imagine if Katie Taylor was in attendance for the Price versus Jonas all-female card and she said something like this. People would think that's pretty rude. Claressa Shields is going to be fighting on an all-female show very soon, opposite the ring Lonnie Daniels, and just imagine if Katie showed up for that fight and said something like this. Most would call that unacceptable, so why are we now supposed to accept it from Claressa Shields, who's taking a big dump on a lot of girls that are helping to elevate the sport a lot more than she is? Because I can almost guarantee you, Claressa's numbers for her fight won't be in the same stratosphere as these numbers.
I can almost guarantee you the interest in Claressa Shields' upcoming fight is nowhere near the same as the interest in this past weekend's bill, and yet, all she can do is glorify herself. As if her individual accolades are doing anything to further the sport, all it's furthering is her own narcissism, her own ego.
You don't hear her carrying on about the viewing figures of her fight with Savannah Marshall to try to shade Katie and Amanda because their trilogy did more than two times the numbers of Shields versus Marshall. She can't pretend to be the same draw that Katie and Amanda are anymore. It's very obvious that you're not.
I mean, she made more headlines for entering into a romantic relationship with Papoose and being in the midst of a lover's triangle between him and his ex-wife, Remy Ma, than any boxing match she had.
This narrative that because of her individual accolades, she is somehow entitled to regularly take dumps on anybody and everybody in the sport of boxing is a logical fallacy because most other women in the sport, in fact, it seems like all the other women in the sport understand that they have the same motive and they're all working towards the same thing.
The rising tide lifts all boats, whereas Claressa is really only trying to uplift herself and glorify herself.
All she ever seems to do is take shots at everybody else. For that, she is nowhere near as popular as Katie Taylor, nowhere near as popular as Amanda Serrano. I'd go as far as saying that Michaela Mayer's 2 fights with Sandy Ryan drew in more viewers and more boxing fans than the last 2 years of Claressa Shields' fights.
And then the fight that she's about to have.
The greatest woman of all times. Perhaps in her own mind, because you can take an independent poll on any social media platform and rate that claim against Katie Taylor or against Amanda Serrano. It's gonna come back the same way every single time. You're not the greatest woman of all times just because you call yourself that any more than I'm the smartest man on the planet.
Exactly.
Touch your ass later. Claressa's all about herself, not elevating the women in the sport today and not elevating the young women coming through behind her. She's all about herself. Thankfully, the sport of women's boxing has much better ambassadors than Claressa Shields. If you're wondering, how is it a 2-time gold medalist and a 3-time undisputed champion could also be one of the most disliked athletes in their own sport? Well, that's why.
No corporate sponsorships, no big endorsement deals, not much drawing power.
That's why. On super middleweight news, on the heels of Hamza Sheeraz's knockout win over Edgar Berlanga, His Excellency Turki El Sheikh took to his social media immediately afterwards and said, Hamza now deserves Canelo in 2026. But Canelo is going to be fighting Terence Crawford this year, and I'm going to assume that whatever happens in the Crawford fight directly affects what happens in that fight.
Yeah.
That proposed fight between Canelo and Hamza, because if Canelo loses to Terence Crawford, well, I don't think Terence is going to fight Hamza.
Does Canelo fight him anyway? Does he fight Hamza win or lose next year? Or, if he loses to Terence, do they do a rematch?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Does Hamza actually deserve a Canelo Alvarez fight for the simple act of knocking out Edgar Berlanga in an intrinsic, ethereal sort of way, since Hamza is not a mandatory challenger to any of the belts that Canelo Alvarez holds? On paper, there are actually more deserving fighters of a Canelo Alvarez fight than Hamza Sheeraz, who has a grand total of 1 fight as a super middleweight. I would say that in terms of deserving the fight, a Christian Mabili might deserve it more, or a Diego Pacheco. They've been at super middleweight this whole time, whereas Hamza just got there.
Deserves can be a 4-letter word depending on the context.
However, if there is an arena where Hamza might deserve the fight more than them, even though he just arrived at super middleweight, it's because he, unlike those fighters, just upstaged Canelo Alvarez. Where Canelo Alvarez went 12 rounds with Edgar Berlanga, Hamza just dispatched him in 5 and made it look very easy. How do you even reconcile that? Hamza is not thought of as a pound-for-pound fighter like Canelo. We know he's not experienced as Canelo, or as decorated, but he fought the same guy that Canelo fought, beat him, knocked him out where Canelo didn't, and made it look easy.
How do you reconcile that?
One of my favorite content creators here on YouTube goes by the name Dwyer. He's got a thing he likes to call ring coverage. That is how you can reconcile Hamza stopping a guy that went the distance with Canelo. Ring coverage. What is it?
What is that?
It's the amount of ground a fighter can cover relative to his physical dimensions relative to that of his opponents. When you look at Hamza's physical dimensions compared to Canelo, he has a lot more ring coverage than Canelo. You hear me say it all the time. Canelo, even though he's fully acclimated to 168, he's not built like a 168-pounder. His physical dimensions are that of a portly junior middleweight or a portly middleweight.
Stocky guy, 5'7" to 5'8", where the median height for a super middleweight is anywhere in between, let's say, 5'10" and 6'3".
Even William Skull, who Canelo Alvarez just fought, was noticeably taller and noticeably longer. Capable as Canelo Alvarez is and acclimated to 168, he doesn't actually have a 168-pounder's frame, whereas Hamza,
he does, and that gives him more ring coverage.
So what does ring coverage have to do with Hamza knocking out a guy that Canelo didn't knock out? Hamza's taller, Hamza's longer, doesn't need to be close to Edgar Berlanga to touch him with punches, whereas Canelo is comparatively shorter, with shorter arms, he does. When Edgar fought Canelo, he spent the majority of that fight circling away from him, moving away from him.
They tried to do that with Hamza in spots, but he couldn't get away from that long jab. Since Hamza has more height than Canelo, more height than Edgar, more reach than both.
There's moments where Edgar's trying to exit the pocket to move away from Hamza, but he's still getting hit with jabs.
Doesn't know how to get away, doesn't know what to do. Not safe on the outside, tries for the inside. Gets lumped up on the inside.
In the exchange, gets knocked down 3 times on the inside. Whereas with Canelo, he didn't spend a whole lot of time on the inside. He spent all 36 minutes of the fight moving away. And because Canelo is shorter, it was harder for Canelo to keep up with him.
To get to him.
If the question is, how did Hamza knock out a guy that Canelo didn't knock out? The short answer is ring coverage.
Hamza's got more of it. You can see that with the naked eye. Plain as day.
Turkey wants to make a fight between them. Does Hamza's big knockout win over Edgar Berlanga mean that he could do that to Canelo Alvarez?
And there's also this boxing math that's going on right now. It's like Canelo couldn't stop Berlanga. He only knocked him down, but Sheeraz destroyed him. Therefore, Sheeraz destroys Canelo, which I'm not exactly ready to say that. Like, Canelo, yes, is on the back 9 of his career. He's not stopping guys, but the guy's never even been, he's been wobbled a few times in his career, never been stopped. I'm not ready to say he gets waxed by anybody, including Hamza Sheeraz.
David Benavidez would have ran through Canelo. I'm like, nobody's running through Canelo. I know David Benavidez is awesome. I know he throws a ton of punches. I know he's way younger, whatever. But nobody's running through this guy. Like, he's still a very, very top guy.
I'm in full agreement with both Chris Algieri and Dan Canastota of CompView Box. Boxing math don't work like that. Triangle theories, they don't work. Just because Hamza knocked out Edgar and Canelo Alvarez didn't, that doesn't then mean that Hamza knocks out Canelo.
Or that Hamza beats Canelo.
Triangle theories don't work in the sport of boxing. Remember that Joe Joyce stopped Joseph Parker, got stopped by Zhilei Zhang, who then got beat by Joseph Parker.
Triangle theories don't work. Now, you can say that Hamza Sheeraz upstaged Canelo because they fought the same guy and Hamza did a better job on him. That's objective.
Hamza beat Edgar Berlanga worse than Canelo Alvarez did, but that doesn't mean he beats Canelo Alvarez.
Why not?
In all the ways that Edgar Berlanga did not know how to deal with the long jab, the height, the length, the ring coverage of Hamza Sheeraz, Canelo's used to dealing with that. He's been dealing with that since he got to 168.
He's not going to be uncomfortable fighting a fighter that's a lot taller than he is, because every fighter that he's fought and every fighter that he's beat at 168 is noticeably taller than he is. Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Edgar Berlanga, Jaime Munguia, William Skull.
All those guys are noticeably taller and longer than Canelo Alvarez, and Canelo beat them all. It would be more of the same with Hamza Sheeraz. Canelo has the ring craft, the ring savvy, and the instincts that Edgar Berlanga doesn't have. So just because you went in there and you pounced on Edgar doesn't mean you're going to now turn around and pounce on Canelo.
In my previous video, we talked about how Edgar Berlanga doesn't even really have a base style. He's not a pure boxer, he's not a boxer puncher, not a pressure guy, he's not in anything. Whereas Canelo, he toggles between two different base styles. Against aggressive fighters, he's a boxer puncher.
It's what he was at 154, and for long spells at 160, at 168, against movers and jabbers and outside guys, he's a pressure guy. He fights like a pressure guy. He toggles between two separate base styles. The really good fighters, like Canelo, often do.
Got two base styles.
Where Edgar Berlanga has none. So where Edgar doesn't know how to deal with the height of a Hamza Sheeraz, so he gets close to him, gets beat on the inside, there's no way Hamza beats Canelo on the inside. I don't like to make bold statements like that, but I don't think for a second Hamza Sheeraz would have the advantage over Canelo within close quarters. He'd try to move, use his height, use his jab, keep Canelo Alvarez out like Callum Smith tried to keep Canelo Alvarez out. Caleb Plant.
I don't think Hamza would want to trade with Canelo Alvarez on the inside. I think he would sooner elect to try to keep him out.
He would try to do that first, and then, if that doesn't work, then he might trade with him, like he traded with Edgar Berlanga, at which point Canelo's shorter arms give him the advantage. Shorter arms within close quarters make for tighter hooks, tighter uppercuts.
The fighter with the shorter arms in close quarters can string together combinations faster than the taller, longer guy with the longer arms who needs more room to work.
In the pocket, Canelo Alvarez would have the edge. I think he'd drill Hamza Sheeraz to his midsection, which would then open him up for head punches, uppercuts, hooks upstairs, right hands over the top.
Rest assured, there are some super middleweights out there that I think Hamza Sheeraz could beat. There are some, but Canelo Alvarez is not one among them. I think Canelo would close the distance on Hamza. I think he'd force him to trade, force the exchanges, and Canelo would win them.
Oh yeah, I think Hamza would try to box from the outside, but I don't think he'd spend the whole fight on his bike like William Skull did or Edgar Berlanga did. No, eventually, he's gonna open up, he's gonna try for some hooks, and that's gonna backfire.
He'll open up for some hooks like he opened up on Edgar Berlanga for some hooks on the inside. Edgar's nowhere near as good as Canelo on the inside.
You do that with him, it's gonna blow up in your face. There's been a lot of talk about what Canelo will do after the Terence Crawford fight. The name of Hamza Sheeraz is not the only name in the hat for a Canelo fight next year. There is also the name of Chris Eubank Jr. And if I had to choose between those two fights, I would choose Hamza. I like that fight better. For some years now, Canelo Alvarez has expressed an interest in perhaps boxing in the United Kingdom. And a fight that I think could bring him there is a Hamza Sheeraz fight.
Assuming that Turkey doesn't want to do it in Saudi or some other exotic location, if there were an ideal fight to take Canelo Alvarez across the pond, I would say it's the Sheeraz fight more than the Eubank fight.
And it might. You never know. If Canelo beats Terence in September, I could totally see him fighting Hamza right after that.